farmers on horseback, a nation of deerstalkers.
The 23rd of May 1842, does that ring a bell? Probably not unless you're a massive military history geek like me. But a very important battle was fought right here where I'm standing now. It was the first of many times Brit and Boer would go toe to toe. Let's go and explore. Now, the Battle of Congella and the siege that followed right here where I'm sat at Durban's old fort needs a bit of background to really be understood. It's really complicated, so pay attention at the back of the class. Okay, let's rewind to the 1830s. The Boers, those Afrikaans-speaking people of Dutch descent, leave the Cape to avoid the dastardly British and their pesky laws and taxes. Can't fault them for that. They become what's known as the voortrekkers, i.e. pioneers or pathfinders. One group of these hardy folk ended up in what's now known as KwaZulu-Natal. Inevitably, the Zulus weren't happy. They massacred a large number of the settlers, only to then get smashed themselves at the Battle of Blood River in 1838. The Boers then set up their own nation, the Republic of Natalia. Keeping up? Good. Let's keep going. Now, there was another group of Europeans in the area at a place called Port Natal. Yep, you've guessed it, the Brits. They'd established a trading station here during the reign of King Shaka. As the wonderful Ian Knight says in his book Warriors in Scarlet, the settlement at Port Natal was new, a ramshackle scattering of wattle and daub huts built among the mangroves and the sand dunes on the edge of a great natural lagoon by a small party of adventurous and predominantly British traders and elephant hunters. In a way, its presence typified the unscripted and often unsanctioned progress of British interests around the world in the decades following Waterloo. The end of the long wars against France created a pool of unemployed sailors and soldiers, many of whom put their training and experience to good use in pursuit of commercial opportunities around the world. And a handful of these were drawn to Port Natal by the lure of possible trading monopoly. Now, inevitably, as we've seen since the beginning of modern South African history, Brit and Boer soon began to tread on one another's toes. It all got rather messy. The new republic wanted access to the coast, moved in and made life rather uncomfortable for the British settlers, who resented the two-tier system that was imposed on them. Then, as Ian Knight says, the Boers stirred up some trouble with local African chiefdoms in an attempt to push them south and out of Natalia. This made the British in the Cape under Major General Sir George Napier twitchy, and they decided they needed to do something about it and protect their interests. In March 1842, General Napier ordered a small force under Captain Thomas Charlton Smith to reoccupy Port Natal. Now, there was one small problem with this. The nearest British garrison was over 300 kilometres away, and they'd have to trek through the bush with no roads and no guides to lead them. Not easy, but remember, these were the days when Brits were Brits, when we had a go anywhere, do anything attitude, and we weren't bogged down with petty health and safety. Anyway, the force that was to achieve this incredible feat was two companies of the 27th Regiment of Foot, aka the Inniskilling Fusiliers, with a small contingent of engineers and some gunners with 3 artillery pieces. There was also a handful of men from the Cape Rifles, a unit of what's known in South Africa as coloureds, i.e. people of historical mixed race. Now, Captain Thomas Smith was a career officer who'd fought in the peninsula and been wounded at Waterloo. It was a slow journey, as you can imagine, with 66 wagons and around 900 oxen. Hard to comprehend that now, isn't it? It must have been an amazing scene, and what an experience for those soldiers from Northern Ireland. Eventually, they reached here, what was then known as Port Natal, but we now call Durban. As you can imagine, the British settlers were over the moon to see them, the voortrekkers, not so much. One of the first things Smith's men did was take down the tricolour flag of Natalia and replace it with a Union flag. But while this was happening, the Boers weren't sat idling. That was never their style, and it still isn't, to be fair. Realising the gravity of the situation at Port Natal, Commandant General Andries Pretorius, the victor of Blood River, began assembling a commando force at his laager by the village of Congella. He had about 364 volunteers under his command. On the 9th of May, Smith and around 100 men marched to Congella and demanded that Pretorius surrender and submit themselves to British authority. You can imagine how that went down, not well. Pretorius did though agree to consult the Volksraad or Parliament. Inevitably, a few days later, the answer came back: tell the Brits to bugger off, or words to that effect. Anyway, both sides were grazing their cattle in the same place when the Afrikaners rode up, opened fire and chased away some of the British cattle. As Ian Knight says, Smith was infuriated. He regarded the trekkers as recalcitrant subjects of the Crown and the attack upon the cattle as an act of armed rebellion which, quote, rendered it absolutely necessary that some steps should be taken to prevent a repetition of such outrages. Smith, desperate for revenge, quickly formulated a plan.
At 2300 on the 23rd of May 1842, Captain Smith and his men set out aiming to come here, where I'm stood now, by the Boer position at Congella. With him were 139 officers and men supported by 2 field guns. He decided to take the long route along the beach where the tide was rising. But he obviously didn't know the Boers. They're not easy people to surprise. It was a bright moon that night and Boer scouts spotted the British lumbering across the beach with their artillery. Hiding behind the mangrove thickets, they opened fire, inflicting heavy casualties on the exposed British force. So in the back of this rather shady park, I found this plaque and stone plinth. It says, during the siege of Port Natal in 1842, the camp of Commandant General A.W. Pretorius was in this vicinity. On the night of the 23rd of May 1842, the 4 trekkers from this camp decisively repulsed an attack by a British force under the command of Captain Smith at Congella.
According to the official history of the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, every time the redcoats stood up in the bright moonlight to reload, they offered to the Boers a target such as every marksman dreams of but seldom sees.
Lieutenant Wyatt was killed as he rode on the back of a gun carriage away from the battle, the bullet going straight through his forage cap. Now he's now buried here at Wyatt Road Cemetery in Durban. This is a military cemetery. And also alongside him are the graves of all the other Enniskillings and the other units who were killed both in the Battle of Congella and then in the subsequent siege. Now I've read that the British total dead at the battle numbered 18. I've also read that the figure was 22 with 6 more missing. Whatever the exact total was, the fact is it had been a bad day at the office for the British. They'd suffered very heavy casualties for no gain.
The British witnessed the Boer way of warfare for the first time. Operating like mounted infantry in skirmishing order, they would ride within range, use their excellent marksmanship to inflict heavy casualties, and then remount and retire out of range. In the South African landscape, it was brutally effective. Let's go back to Ian Knight's book again. He says, the Battle of Congella as it became known is little remembered today, but it's not without its significance. It was the first time, of many as it would turn out, that regular British troops would go into action against armed Boer civilians, and it established something of a melancholy blueprint for all the conflict to come. Anyway, Smith consoled himself that the Boers had also suffered badly, but the truth was they hadn't. Again, the number varies, but the casualties for the Boers were between 1 and 4 men. Anyway, with the battle lost and casualties high, Smith and his force became disordered and fled back to the fort that they had built. They'd lost the initiative and were now about to be besieged.
So this is the entrance to what's called the Old Fort in Durban.
The Boers are probably the greatest mounted infantry force of the last 200 years. Their marksmanship, initiative and fieldcraft are second to none. But siege warfare is not their speciality. They're practical soldiers who don't believe in following suicidal orders. Forlorn hopes are not for them. Therefore, they didn't launch a serious assault. Instead, they attempted to force Smith to surrender by cutting him and his men off from resupply and bombarding them with artillery and small arms fire.
So I didn't expect to find this here in the Old Fort Gardens. This is a model. I don't know when it was made, but it's actually quite impressive, if slightly run down. You can see the trenches of the old fort. You can see the wagons where they made the lager. And of course, you can see the redcoats.
Smith, desperate for help, called upon a local man to break through the siege and fetch help.
And so the task fell to this chap, a hard-as-nails settler called Dick King.
Funnily enough, King had fought alongside the Boers at the Battle of Congella in 1838 and, get this, had even been mauled by a lion and survived. He was a tough lad. On the early morning of the 25th, Dick and his servant, a Zulu called Ndongeni, mounted their horses and snuck through the Boer lines and headed into the bush. Local Zulus, sympathetic to the British, advised them and even helped hide their trail as they rushed towards the nearest British garrison, hundreds of kilometres away.
On the 4th of June, King finally reached Grahamstown, 960 kilometres from Durban. It was a hell of a journey. It's said that King handed over his dispatches and then promptly collapsed from exhaustion. I don't blame him. Ndongeni was so battered by the journey, King had left him behind near the border in order to find a doctor and recover. A relief force was quickly organised. 800 redcoats, mainly of the 25th Regiment of Foot, were loaded onto HMS Southampton and HMS Conch.
So help was finally on its way for those soldiers and civilians trapped here in the makeshift fort.
The British wagons and tents had been ripped to shreds. Food was nearly finished and the redcoats were exhausted.
So here inside the old fort area of Durban, I found this plaque. It says here, these are the original defensive earthworks which surrounded the camp in 1842. And you really can make them out. They still exist and they're still worth a visit. So this is the beauty of actually visiting a location yourself. You find out so much. I didn't know any of these plaques were here, and I certainly didn't know you could still see the earthworks. So another interesting thing on the edge of Old Fort is the memorable Order of Tin Hat Shell Hole. Now, the moth clubs are like the equivalent of Britain's British Legion, I guess. That's about as close as I can make it. But there's actually a museum there, and if you're lucky enough, you can go in. Let's have a look.
But on the 25th of June, just as Smith was losing hope, a rocket out to sea told them that help was at hand. Whew, what a relief. But it wasn't over just yet. The entrance to Durban Bay is blocked by a sandbar, and it was a tricky job to land troops. Early in the afternoon of the 26th, the Conch, the smaller of the two vessels, came inshore and was able to land a small force of infantry. They pushed forward, and the Boers, aware that the might of the British Empire was now arriving, sensibly withdrew. The British were finally victorious. The Natalia flag was once again pulled down and the commandos returned home. Over the following years, the British increased their control of the region, formally annexing it in 1845. Once again, you can imagine how that went down with the Boers, most of whom upped sticks once more and headed into the interior of southern Africa. As you know, this wasn't the last time Britain-Boer came to blow, but this forgotten battle set the tone and gave some big clues as to what was to come in the future.